She's 23, pays rent on time, reads books, or she used to. Last Tuesday, she sat down with one, a real one, paper, and made it 4 pages before her hand moved to her phone without her deciding to move it. You're going to recognize yourself in one of 3 people by the end of this. Maybe not the age, the pattern underneath it. She didn't choose to stop reading. Her brain did. And her brain had been trained to do exactly that, one variable reward at a time since she was 13. He's 16. His teachers call him bright. During a 30-minute study period last month, his teacher watched him stare at a blank wall, unable to produce a single sentence. Not rebelling, not distracted by a phone. The phones were away, just absent, waiting for something to happen to him. She's 8. Her mother hands her a tablet at restaurants. Has since she was 2. She doesn't ask for it anymore. She expects it. When it's taken away, she doesn't cry. She doesn't throw a fit. She just freezes, like a screen that lost its signal. 3 people, 3 ages, 1 mechanism, and it's already running. Here's the belief this video destroys before it builds anything else. This is not about weak generations, not about lazy kids or checked-out parents. What happened to these 3 people is more precise than that, and more disturbing. Every single one of them made the rational choice for their moment. The trap wasn't visible. That's what made it a trap. The mechanism underneath all 3 cases has a name, but before we name it, feel it first. You have prefolds. Everyone does. They're the natural creases in human psychology. The desire for social status, the fear of being excluded, the compulsion to know if someone responded to you. These aren't weaknesses. They're architecture. They evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to keep humans alive inside social groups. The platforms know exactly where your prefolds are, and they were built to fold you along those lines, not metaphorically, literally. The teams that designed these systems studied behavioral psychology, persuasion science, and neuroscience specifically to identify where human attention bends naturally, and then to apply pressure at exactly those points. Sean Parker said it out loud, founding president of Facebook. The goal was to consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible, not to connect people, to capture time. He said this publicly, on stage. The crowd applauded. Justin Rosenstein invented the like button. He now calls what he built digital heroin. His words, the man who designed the feedback loop you check 40 times a day. Chamath Palihapitiya was Facebook's VP of user growth. He left and said he felt tremendous guilt for building tools that were ripping apart the social fabric of how society works. 3 architects, 3 admissions of guilt. None of them let their own children near the product they built. The first version of the trap looked like connection. Generation Z, born 1997 to 2012. Most got their first smartphone in middle school, some earlier. What they got wasn't a phone. It was a slot machine. A hammer sits in a drawer and does nothing until you pick it up. A slot machine has its own agenda. Every time you pull down to refresh a feed, you're pulling a lever. Sometimes you win. A funny video, a like on something you posted, a message from someone you wanted to hear from. Sometimes nothing. But it's not the winning that keeps you pulling. It's not knowing. That uncertainty is the mechanism. The brain's reward system, the same circuitry that evolved to make food taste good and social belonging feel essential, releases dopamine in anticipation, not at the reward, before it. The slot machine works because the pull itself becomes the compulsion. The scroll becomes the addiction, not the content. For Gen Z, the specific flavor was social. The early platforms were built around a social graph, a digital map of real-world connections. Your feed was people you actually knew. The dopamine was tied to validation from people whose opinions genuinely mattered to you. Likes, comments, follower counts. The like button launched in 2009, the retweet the same year. Overnight, social interaction had a number attached to it. Your worth, quantified, updated in real time. The contextual rule that made this feel right. Everyone had one. By 2012, not having a smartphone wasn't freedom. It was isolation. You weren't opting out. You were being left behind. The belonging was real. The friendships were real. The phone was the medium through which real things happened. The decision that felt rational, stay connected, post, respond, be available, where the trap revealed itself, when the medium became the point. When Gen Z girls started measuring their value in likes on a selfie. when the front-facing camera created a culture of perpetual social comparison that never turned off, because the phone never turned off. When the fear of being left on read produced a low-grade chronic anxiety that researchers started describing as a state of permanent high alert. When users tried to put the phone down and couldn't account for the last 3 hours. 9 hours. That's the average daily screen time for Gen Z. 9 hours. And 76% of them will tell you they know it's too much. They know. They just can't stop. Because the system wasn't built to let them stop. There's a generation in their 20s right now who describe their phone not as a tool they use, but as a tether they can't cut. Some of them have started downgrading to flip phones deliberately. Not out of nostalgia, but out of desperation. Describing the years before the smartphone as a time when a quiet moment was just a quiet moment, not a trigger to reach for a device. When the inside of their head belonged to them. The invisible cost no one talks about. When every micro moment of silence gets filled with a high dopamine stimulus, the brain stops knowing how to generate its own experience. Boredom used to be the beginning of something, a thought, an idea, a realization that you could entertain yourself. Gen Z had boredom optimized out of their adolescence before their prefrontal cortex finished developing. He's 16, which puts him at the exact hinge point, old enough to remember a version of childhood before the algorithm fully personalized itself, young enough that it found him before he'd built any resistance. He's not carrying the social validation wound the way a 23-year-old does. He didn't grow up measuring his worth in likes, but he's not Gen Alpha either. What he got was the transition moment, when the machine shifted from social to algorithmic, when the question stopped being, "What do my friends think?" and started being, "What does the feed give me next?" He's sitting at a blank page wondering why his brain won't start. The answer isn't that he has nothing to say. It's that generating thought from nothing, sitting with blankness until something arrives, is a muscle. And the environment he grew up in never asked him to use it. What comes after him makes his version look like a minor inconvenience. Generation Alpha. Born 2013 onward. The first generation for whom, before smartphones, is not a memory. It's not even a concept. 40% of Gen Alpha children have their own tablet by age 2. By age 4, 58%. By age 8, 1 in 4 has their own cell phone. By 12, 6 in 10. And here's what makes this categorically different from the Gen Z case. The age of exposure didn't just drop. It dropped into a developmental window that has no equivalent in human history. Infancy and early childhood are when the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls impulse resistance, decision-making, and the ability to delay gratification, is at its most plastic, most impressionable, and most completely incapable of any resistance to what the environment is doing to it. The platform mechanism changed too. Gen Z had to build a social network before the dopamine kicked in. They had to find people, follow accounts, create a presence. There was still some active participation required. Gen Alpha just has to exist within range of a screen. The platforms they're being raised on run on an interest graph, not a social graph. TikTok, YouTube Shorts, these don't require the child to know anyone, don't require them to search for anything, don't require any decision at all. The AI watches how long they pause on each video, how fast they scrolled past another, whether they watched something twice. It maps attention patterns in real time and delivers the next piece of content before the brain has finished processing the last one. This state has a name: the machine zone. It's the same psychological state that keeps people at slot machines for 6 hours without realizing it. And for a 2-year-old, there is no resistance available. The prefrontal cortex isn't online yet. The machine trains the brain before the brain has the equipment to notice it's being trained. The contextual rule that made this feel right: tablets are educational, letter tracing apps, alphabet songs, documentaries about animals, and parents are working multiple jobs, running on margins of their own attention. A device that keeps a 2-year-old safe and occupied is not laziness, it's survival. The decision that felt rational: use the screen, not as a treat, as infrastructure, as the default setting for any moment that needs managing. Where the trap reveals itself: in the classroom. Teachers with 20-30 years of experience describe early Gen Alpha students as categorically different from every cohort they've seen before. Not worse students, different brains. One teacher with 3 decades in the classroom described it this way. She asks a question, waits, and watches a student's face, not the face of someone thinking, the face of someone waiting to be fed. The gap between what a classroom offers and what an algorithm delivers has grown so wide that sitting in a lesson now registers in the body as discomfort, not boredom. Discomfort, like being asked to read by candlelight after a lifetime of stadium floodlights. And the dose keeps climbing, because that's how the system works. The more stimulation the brain receives, the more it needs to register the same response. A video that would have held a 10-year-old's attention for an hour 3 years ago barely lands today. The algorithm knows this. That's why content gets faster, louder, more extreme. Not because creators got worse, because the threshold never stops moving. There's a phenomenon educators are calling the Gen Z stare, though it's appearing younger now in Gen Alpha children who haven't reached adolescence. A student present in body, absent in every other way, not rebellion, not defiance. A brain in standby mode, waiting for the next input to arrive from outside rather than generating one from within, because that's the only environment it has ever known. And then there's what happens when you remove the screen entirely and ask a Gen Alpha child to sit with nothing. Many don't know what to do, not because they're badly behaved, because boredom was never allowed to last long enough to teach them anything. Boredom is not the enemy. Boredom is the trigger. It's where imagination starts, where internal thought begins, where a child discovers they can generate their own experience, that the world doesn't have to happen to them. When every micro moment of friction gets immediately resolved by a screen, that discovery never happens. The cost shows up in specific, observable ways. A child who can't sit through a meal without a device. A 12-year-old who, when asked to write a paragraph about anything at all, stares at the page and says they can't think of anything. Not because they're unintelligent, but because the muscle was never built. An 8-year-old who, when frustrated, doesn't cry, doesn't ask for help, doesn't try a different approach. They go still and wait for someone to hand them a screen. Screen as pacifier. Screen as solution. Screen as the only known answer to any moment that feels like too much. Gen Z lost the skill. Gen Alpha never built it. Now here's what both generations share underneath the surface. Imagine someone designed a bowl that secretly refilled itself as you ate. You'd consume more soup. Not because you're greedy, because the visual signal that tells you you're finished never appears. Psychologists ran this exact experiment. People ate 73% more from the refilling bowl without realizing it. No one noticed. No one felt stuffed. The cue that should have stopped them was just gone. Infinite scroll is that bowl. Autoplay is that bowl. The next page button was removed not by accident, but because that micro moment of decision, do I keep going, was costing platforms users. The chapter ending, the closing credits, the final page, the natural stopping point, all of it engineered out of the experience. To stop, you have to make a conscious, effortful decision to interrupt the default state. And a brain that's been running on variable reward schedules for hours doesn't make effortful decisions well. This is the economic logic underneath both generations. Your attention is finite. There are only 24 hours in a day, and humans must sleep. Every minute a child's focus sits on one platform is a minute lost to every competitor. So the competition becomes, as Tristan Harris described it, a race to the bottom of the brainstem. Stop appealing to rational, deliberate thought. Start targeting primitive, automatic responses, the ones that don't ask questions. Consider what that actually means at scale. If a company wanted to implant a chip in a child's brain, it would require years of clinical trials, ethical review boards, documented safety records. But we allowed a digital implant, one that operates on the same reward circuitry, restructures the same neural pathways, shapes the same developing mind, to enter the lives of 2 full generations of children without a single regulatory test. And here's the number that frames the full picture. Outdoor play among children dropped 29.4% between 1975 and 2015. Out-of-home socialization dropped 14.7%. Screen-based activity increased 22.4%. The play-based childhood, where children took real risks, resolved real conflicts without adults mediating, built resilience through unsupervised experience with genuine stakes, collapsed. And into that vacuum came the phone-based childhood. Jonathan Haidt's framing is precise. Parents overprotected their children in the real world and underprotected them in the virtual one. Children were barred from walking to the park alone. but handed unsupervised access to platforms designed by the best behavioral engineers in the world to capture and hold their attention indefinitely. We are inside the experiment. The results are starting to come in. Here's where intellectual honesty matters. Some researchers push back. One study found that social media use explains less than 1% of the variance in adolescent well-being. Comparable, the researchers noted, to whether or not a teenager regularly eats potatoes. That finding deserves to be taken seriously. The relationship between screens and mental health is genuinely complex. Rising diagnosis rates may partly reflect better screening rather than more suffering. Family relationships, sleep quality, real-world bullying, these carry more statistical weight than screen time alone. And the type of use matters. Creating content, video calling a friend, learning a skill, active digital engagement carries a different risk profile than passive consumption driven entirely by an algorithm. The problem isn't the device, it's the specific design of what happens when you pick it up. The potato comparison breaks down the moment you notice that potatoes were not designed by a team of behavioral scientists to make you eat as many potatoes as possible. The bowl of potatoes doesn't secretly refill. It doesn't notify you when you put it down. It doesn't send a vibration at 11 p.m. to pull you back. And the potato companies didn't build a system to detect your emotional state in real time and adjust the flavor accordingly. So, where does that leave you? When you wake up and check your notifications, you are not choosing what to think about. You're choosing from a menu that someone else designed, for their purposes, not yours. The most important question isn't what's on the menu, it's what got left off. Remember the prefolds. The platforms didn't create your vulnerabilities. The need for belonging, the fear of exclusion, the hunger for validation. Those are human, ancient. What the platforms did was locate every natural fold in your psychology and apply pressure at precisely the right point, before you knew the pressure was coming. Knowing where your folds are is the beginning of not being bent by someone else's profit margin. If you're Gen Z, the escape isn't abstinence, it's friction. Every stopping cue the platforms removed, you add back manually. The phone in another room before you sit down to do anything that requires a complete thought. Notifications that answer only to a person calling you directly. Your attention treated as the finite, non-renewable resource it actually is. If you're raising someone in Gen Alpha, the work is environmental before it's behavioral. The brain being built right now is the brain that will show up to every future challenge. Boredom that gets to last long enough to teach something. Frustration that has to be navigated rather than preempted. These aren't cruelties. They're construction. The platform will not restructure itself to protect that process. It was never even close to that. She's 23, 4 pages before her hand moved without her deciding to move it. She didn't choose that. The system chose it for her, one variable reward at a time, starting when she was 13, and her brain was still figuring out what kind of organ it was going to become. He's 16, staring at the blank page, waiting for something to happen to him. He grew up at the exact hinge point, old enough to remember before the algorithm fully arrived, young enough that it found him before any defense was built. He's not waiting because he has nothing to say. He's waiting because the world trained him to receive, not to generate. She's 8, frozen when the tablet disappears, not crying, not angry, just gone. A brain in standby, waiting for the signal that tells it what to experience next. 3 versions of the same mechanism. The clothes were different. The machine underneath was identical, and the machine was built deliberately by people who understood exactly what they were doing, and who made sure their own children never got near it. You came in thinking this was about a generation making a mistake. Here's the real question. If the people who designed this system protected their own kids from it, what does that say about every moment you've handed your attention over without asking why? You're not the customer. You never were.